Ahoy! Nightingale just released, and if you're currently in the early game, then I have some tips that will definitely make your life a little bit easier, as well as some extra bits of info that aren't super obvious, so this should hopefully help you out. Let's start off with Essence Dust, which you need quite a fair bit of in the early game, since there are quite a few recipes and things that you want to unlock. Now you can just run around and press E on every stick that you see and extract all of those and all the weeds into Essence, but my mate Freedom actually found an easier way to do that. Once you have built a simple workbench, you can just run around for a quick moment and collect some rocks. You really don't need that many. I ran around for less than 1.5 minutes here and ended up with 78 rocks, and then went to the workbench and turned those into simple rock marbles. Once the crafting was complete, that resulted in more than 250 rock marbles, and each of those salvages into 2 essence dust. So if I hadn't kept some for my crossbow, I would have ended up with 500 essence dust in a super short amount of time. And with that essence dust, you can then unlock everything available at the trader, so you don't have to keep coming back for recipes and similar things. It is, however, worth keeping in mind that the trader also sells resources directly, and sometimes this can be a lot more convenient than actually crafting the resource yourself. Not in all cases, but for example, if you have a lot of essence anyways, like you would if you do the rock trick, then you may want to buy ink from the vendor instead of going through the process of making ink yourself early on, which is needed to progress to other realms, so I personally found that to be a much quicker way. Next, I would highly recommend upgrading your pickaxe as one of your early tools. That's because while the other tools when upgraded can perform their tasks faster, the pickaxe is directly restricted in which resources you can mine early on, and you will need a better one fairly quickly in order to get resources that you need to advance to progress in the game, and that's not the case for the other tools. Of course, you can choose to not do this if you're playing in a party with someone else, but then you are completely reliant on them farming those resources for you. It is, by the way, not the worst idea to have multiple tools and weapons upgrade in general because of the combat mechanics. One thing that isn't made super obvious by the game is that the mobs you're fighting have weaknesses and resistances, and not every weapon will be equally effective against every target. So for example, if I'm hitting a boar and I use the axe, that will deal increased damage, which is indicated by an up arrow next to the damage numbers. This difference can be very noticeable. Some people, especially in the early playtest, used to struggle with the first, let's call it tutorial boss, and I want to show you what happens if you fight it with 2 people using a weapon that is strong against them, which in this case would be the maul. This is on hard difficulty, and you can see that the health bar is absolutely getting decimated, so these advantages really factor in heavily in certain fights, so you should be somewhat aware of them and try to have some different weapons to utilize them. I haven't found out every weakness yet, but I might make a video about that in the future, so if you're interested in that, consider subscribing and clicking the bell. This next tip is a bit of a bonus one because it is a bit more timing specific. When going through the early tutorial stages, you eventually end up in a swamp area. In that swamp area, before you go through the portal at the end as instructed, have a look at the towers. You can see those in the distance, and they seem to not be procedurally generated and seem to be the same for everyone. It is definitely worth checking out the one with a balloon next to it, because this will provide you with an umbrella right away, which comes in very handy, especially if you start with the desert biome, but also in general to just be protected from rain. It also enables you to float, so it's just good all around, and you can find it in this chest up here. There's something worth noting specifically about the umbrella that I wanted to show you here, but unfortunately I messed up and broke my leg. We'll get back to that in a second, but what I wanted to show you is that when you hover with the umbrella and you get to a ledge, then you will not automatically mantle, and this is worth keeping in mind. So if you're just barely missing a ledge and you think you can actually make it up, then you need to stop using the umbrella, so press spacebar and press spacebar again to do the mantle input. This is worth keeping in mind if you're floating for a long distance and you need to get to a specific edge of something. This next tip may sound very unrelated to the previous one, but it'll make sense in a second. If you want to heal yourself mid-combat, it is worth putting a healing potion or healing salve onto your Q key. This is a separate key from the other consumables which you have to equip to use them first, and is an instant hotkey instead. It isn't really mentioned much in-game because it was introduced very, very recently. It was not in the previous playtest yet, and it makes your life a whole lot easier. You can see that I can even use consumables while blocking, so there's no animation or anything, and I still get the full heal, and that is just making things so much easier, especially in difficult fights. So you absolutely want to slot something there as quickly as possible. Now, why is this tip related to the last one? If you look closely, at the beginning of that fight, I had a broken leg from falling down from that tower. And at the end of that fight, that was gone after I used the healing salve. That's because the healing salve does not only heal you, but it also heals any injuries you have. And that is something that is definitely worth keeping in mind, and I would keep some on me just in case you slip and fall somewhere, break an ankle, break a leg or anything like that, because otherwise that will slow you down for quite a long time. That said, you may occasionally need to quickly use a consumable that is not on your Q but just on your hotbar. And if you're holding a two-handed weapon, then you're not holding any other consumable along with that. That is actually not quite as big of a problem as it may seem. If you have a consumable or any kind of useful tool on your hotbar on the 6 to 0 buttons, that can be pre-saved basically. So for example, you're holding a one-handed weapon and you have a certain type of food equipped in your other hand, and then you switch to your two-handed weapon, the game still has that same consumable selected. So even though you're holding a two-handed weapon, if you hold down F, or the interact key for your consumable, that will still switch you over to the consumable and will allow you to use that consumable without having to switch to another weapon first. It still ends up switching off your two-handed weapon at that moment, but I would say it's still better than having to switch first. On the topic of your F key, in the early game you don't have access to ranged weapons yet, but you kinda do. If you craft any torches, you are able to throw those at enemies with the F key, and it actually does some fire damage, some damage over time to them, so they're not entirely useless. They're not particularly great in that regard, also they feel very clunky to throw, but that may be my 150 ping, but it's still better than no ranged weapon at all. But we don't just want to throw stuff, we also want to pick up some things, namely loot. And normally you do that by just clicking everything individually, pressing E on everything and picking it up, but there's a much more convenient way to collect everything around you in quite a big radius, and that's to simply hold E on an item that's on the ground, and that will just mass collect everything around you. Very convenient. But if you collect a lot of loot, it might also get heavy fairly quickly. Of course, you can craft a backpack to help with that, but there's also another additional option that I want to point out. Very early on, you get a side quest to help someone build some simple structures. And I would highly recommend doing this because this allows you to recruit a follower. This recruit comes in handy in a ton of ways. They are pretty good as tanks in combat because they kind of just attract a lot of the enemies around them. They can help with gathering tasks. They can do a lot of things for you, and I would highly recommend having one with you pretty much all the time. But in addition to all of that and being able to revive you, they also don't seem to follow the same rules when it comes to inventory weight. This is particularly useful when traveling from one world to another, because while traveling from a world you want to bring a decent amount of resources to build your base up quickly, and normally a lot of those resources are fairly heavy, especially things like stone and wood. Now your own inventory is bigger, so all the small things that you want to take with you are better placed in your inventory, everything that doesn't weigh too much, but then the heavy stuff that you might need a lot of are things that you can easily place in your recruit's inventory by interacting with them. This is especially useful if you want to bring over some refined heavy stuff like lumber or ingots, for example. I have one more recommendation, and that's to buy the recipe for a simple candle, but that's something we'll talk about in a future video, so if you're interested in that, consider subscribing and clicking the bell. Likewise, if you want to see Nightingale content in general, I have more coming up. Thanks to my patrons for supporting this video, and thank you for watching. Duke Sloth, out.